The hiss was almost imperceptible, a sound lost beneath the clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation at La Lanterne, one of Manhattan's most obscenely expensive restaurants. But Eleanor Hayes heard it. From her station by the kitchen doors, she saw it too. A tiny, almost invisible effervescence in the water glass of the girl at table 7. The girl, no older than 12, with eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky, slid a perfectly manicured finger to the base of the crystal glass. A moment later, a hairline fracture appeared, racing up the side like a bolt of frozen lightning. Then, with a sharp ping that cut through the dining room's decorum, the baccarat glass split in two, spilling ice water across the pristine white tablecloth. The girl was Cassandra Sterling. Her father, seated opposite her, was Julian Sterling, the titan of tech whose face graced the cover of Wired and Forbes with unnerving regularity. He hadn't built an empire. He had built the digital infrastructure on which other empires were born. He could solve global supply chain logistics with an algorithm written on a cocktail napkin, but he couldn't survive a single dinner with his own daughter. This was the 3rd restaurant this month. Cassandra, the tabloids called her the Sterling Scourge, had a unique, almost scientific approach to chaos. Tutors with PhDs in childhood development lasted, on average, a week. A former British SAS officer, hired for discipline and structure, had resigned via a tearful text message after 3 days. Eleanor, 24 years old, and 3 payments behind on the loan for her grandfather's memory care facility, knew the difference between a tantrum and a tactical operation. This was the latter. She watched as the maitre d', a man who exuded the unflappable calm of a bomb disposal expert, rushed to the table. Julian Sterling was already pulling out a black credit card, his face a mask of weary resignation. "My apologies, Henri. Add the damages to the bill. We'll be leaving." "It's quite all right, Mr. Sterling." "An accident," Henri murmured, his eyes carefully avoiding the girl. "It wasn't an accident," Cassandra said, her voice clear and precise. "It was thermal shock induced by a rapid endothermic reaction. The glass couldn't handle the temperature differential." Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at his daughter not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He was a man drowning in an ocean of his own making, and his daughter was the storm. As the Sterling party prepared to make their exit, Henri caught Eleanor's eye and gave a subtle, desperate jerk of his head. It was her job to clean up the mess. She grabbed a tray with fresh napkins and a dustpan. But as she approached the table, she didn't look at the sodden mess on the linen. She looked directly at Cassandra. "Sodium metal wrapped in a tissue capsule to delay the reaction," Eleanor said, her voice low and calm. "Clever. But the fizz gives it away. If you really want to fracture glass without a sound, you should use a carbide-tipped scribe, a quick scratch and a single drop of cold water. Silent. Far more elegant." The entire table froze. Julian Sterling looked at Eleanor as if she'd just sprouted a second head. Henry's mouth was slightly agape, but Cassandra's reaction was the most telling. The bored, contemptuous mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine curiosity lit her grey eyes. "Who are you?" Cassandra demanded. "I'm Ellie. I'm the person who has to clean this up," she replied, beginning to carefully gather the shards of crystal. "And I'm a student. My focus is on material sciences in art conservation. We spend a lot of time studying how things break down, deliberately or otherwise." She glanced up at the girl. "You have a good grasp of chemistry, but your execution is a little loud. It screams for attention." Julian Sterling, who had been halfway out of his chair, slowly sat back down. He wasn't looking at the mess, or his daughter. He was looking at the waitress who had just diagnosed his daughter's behavior as a flaw in her scientific method. "What would you suggest?" Julian asked, his voice a low rumble. Eleanor paused, a shard of glass held delicately between her thumb and forefinger. "I'd suggest that a girl smart enough to weaponize basic chemistry is probably smart enough to know that what she really wants isn't to break a glass." She looked back at Cassandra, holding her gaze. "The question is, what is it you're actually trying to say?" For the first time that evening, Cassandra Sterling was silent. She had no retort, no scientific explanation. She had been seen, not as a monster or a spoiled brat, but as a puzzle. And the waitress, with her worn-out shoes and hands that smelled faintly of lemon polish, had just solved the first piece. Julian didn't leave. He paid the bill, but he lingered by the door as Eleanor finished clearing the table. He pressed a folded bill into Henry's hand and spoke in a low voice. An hour later, as Eleanor was hanging up her apron, Henry handed her a heavy, cream-colored business card. "Mr. Sterling's personal assistant will be calling you in the morning," Henry said, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. He said, and I quote, "Don't go anywhere." Eleanor looked at the card. It didn't have a phone number. It had a private address and a time. 9 North M. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Her grandfather's facility had just raised its rates. She was deep in debt, working 2 jobs to stay afloat while pursuing her master's degree. She couldn't afford trouble. But as she walked out into the cool New York night, she realized she might not be able to afford to say no either. The Sterling residence was not a penthouse. It was a sovereign nation, occupying the top 4 floors of a skyscraper overlooking Central Park. The air inside felt filtered and sterile, smelling of nothing at all. The art on the walls wasn't hung for beauty, but for impact, each piece a declaration of financial dominance. Eleanor, in her only good blazer, felt like a microbe under a microscope. Julian Sterling was waiting for her in a study that was larger than her entire apartment. He wasn't the defeated man from the restaurant. Here, surrounded by screens displaying fluctuating market data, he was a king in his element. "Ms. Hayes," he began, gesturing to a chair that probably cost more than her tuition. "Thank you for coming. Your maître d' made it sound like I didn't have a choice." A hint of a smile touched Sterling's lips. "Henri is prone to drama. Please, sit." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Last night you did something no one else has managed to do. You got my daughter to shut up." "I just pointed out a flaw in her technique." "No," Sterling corrected. "You did more than that. You spoke her language. Everyone else sees the behavior. The anger, the destruction. They try to manage it with therapy, with discipline, with medication. They see a problem to be solved. You saw an equation. You saw the method." Eleanor thought for a moment. "I saw a kid who's desperate to be understood, and she's using the only language she thinks anyone will listen to." Sterling nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Her mother, Amelia, she passed away 3 years ago. She was a painter. Brilliant. Her father, Cassandra's grandfather, was a Nobel laureate in chemistry. Amelia was a bridge between those 2 worlds, art and science. Since she's been gone, Cassandra has retreated entirely into her grandfather's world. But she's using his gifts for this." He gestured vaguely, as if the chaos his daughter created was a physical presence in the room. "I'm at my limit, Miss Hayes. I run a company with 100,000 employees. I can predict geopolitical shifts from data patterns, but I can't connect with my own child. She's drifting away, and I don't know how to bring her back." The vulnerability was startling, a crack in the formidable facade. "Mr. Sterling, I'm an art history student. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not qualified for whatever this is." "The qualified people have failed," he said, his voice flat. "They come in with their textbooks and their theories, and she runs circles around them. They're afraid of her, or they're intimidated by me. You were neither. You weren't impressed, and you weren't scared. You were just curious." He stood up and walked to the vast window overlooking the park. "I want to hire you. Not as a governess or a tutor. I don't know what to call it. A translator. I want you to spend time with her. After school, weekends. I want you to do what you did last night. Talk to her. Figure out the equation." Eleanor's mind was racing. "I can't. I have 2 jobs. I have my classes. My grandfather. I will pay you $500,000 a year," Sterling said, turning from the window. Eleanor stopped breathing. The number was so vast it felt like a joke. It was an escape hatch from her entire life. It was the best care for her grandfather. It was freedom. "I will also," he continued, "endow a grant in your name at Columbia to cover the full cost of your PhD and any research you wish to conduct. Indefinitely." This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" "Because for the first time in 3 years I saw my daughter look at someone without contempt. You didn't treat her like she was broken. You treated her like she was brilliant." Before she could process the offer, a sharp, cultured voice cut through the room. "Julian, you can't possibly be entertaining this folly." A woman entered from a connecting room. She was tall and impossibly elegant, dressed in a severe yet chic grey suit. Her dark hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her sharp cheekbones. She looked at Eleanor with the kind of disdain usually reserved for insects. "Beatrice, this doesn't concern you," Julian said, his tone hardening. "Cassandra is my niece. Her well-being is my primary concern," Beatrice Sterling said, her eyes never leaving Eleanor. "And you are proposing to entrust her to a waitress? What skills do you possibly possess that a team of the world's best child psychologists do not?" "She knows the difference between sodium metal and a carbide scribe," Julian said dryly. "Don't be glib. The girl needs structure and professional guidance, not a playmate from a diner." She turned her full attention to Eleanor. "Tell me, Miss Hayes, what precisely is your long-term plan here? To critique her choice of chemical reagents until she magically behaves?" Eleanor felt a surge of defiance. She stood up, her hands clasped behind her back to hide their trembling. "You're right, Miss Sterling. I'm not a professional. I don't have a degree in therapy. But I also don't see Cassandra as a case study to be managed. And frankly, your professional guidance doesn't seem to be working." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "You are insolent." "I'm observant," Eleanor countered. "And what I observe is a family that's so terrified of a problem that you've forgotten to look at the person." She turned to Julian. "If I accept your offer, Mr. Sterling, I have conditions." Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh. "Conditions? You are in no position to—" "What are they?" Julian interrupted, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "One," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not a member of your staff. I don't wear a uniform. I'm not here to discipline her. I am here to engage with her. That means I need access to everything that is a part of her world. Her lab, her mother's old studio, everything." "Fine," Julian said. "Two," she continued, looking directly at Beatrice. "Ms. Sterling stays away. Her input, her observations, her concern. It's part of the problem. It's another variable in an already complicated equation. When I am with Cassandra, we are to be left alone." "Julian, this is outrageous," Beatrice snapped. "She is shutting out family." Julian looked at his sister, then back at Eleanor. "Done." Beatrice's face was a mask of cold fury. "You will regret this. You are choosing a stranger over your own sister." She gave Eleanor a final look that promised retribution and swept out of the room. "And 3?" Julian asked, his voice quiet. "3," Eleanor said, taking a deep breath. "You can't buy your way out of this. Your money is the reason I'm listening. But it won't solve the problem. I'm not a replacement for her father. If I tell you we need to have dinner at a specific time, you are there. No conference calls, no emergencies. If I say Cassandra needs you to look at one of her projects, you look at it. You engage. Otherwise, I'm just another distraction, and this is all a colossal waste of time." Julian Sterling, the man who moved markets with a single word, looked at the young woman dictating terms to him in his own office. A slow, tired but genuine smile spread across his face. "When can you start?" Eleanor's first week was a masterclass in strategic resistance. Cassandra treated her not with hostility, but with a cold, clinical curiosity, as if Eleanor were a new specimen to be catalogued and dissected. Cassandra would set intellectual traps, asking obscure questions about inorganic chemistry or theoretical physics, expecting Eleanor to fail. "The Haber-Bosch process," Cassandra stated one afternoon in the vast, silent library. "Is it an elegant solution or a brute force environmental catastrophe?" "Both," Eleanor replied without looking up from the book she was reading, a detailed analysis of Goya's black paintings. "Like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You get the nut, but you destroy the table. It depends on whether you value the nut or the table more." Cassandra fell silent, annoyed that her gambit had been so easily neutralized. She escalated. The next day, Eleanor found the leather on her worn-out sneakers strangely stiff and faded. "Looks like you walked through a mild acid solution," Cassandra observed with feigned innocence. "The pH in the city's puddles can be so unpredictable." Eleanor looked at her shoes, then at Cassandra. "True. It's a good thing I know that a paste of baking soda and water will neutralize it." She smiled faintly. "It's a basic principle of conservation. You have to understand what causes the decay before you can stop it." The real battlefield, however, was Amelia Sterling's art studio. Julian had granted Eleanor access, but the room had been locked and preserved since the day Amelia died, a perfect, dust-free mausoleum. It was filled with half-finished canvases, the scent of turpentine and oil paint still lingering in the air. In a corner, however, was a section that was clearly not Amelia's. It was a pristine, modern chemistry station, a tribute from Julian to her father. It sat there, gleaming and unused, a monument to a different kind of genius. Cassandra refused to enter the room. She would stand in the doorway, her arms crossed, a silent, defiant sentinel. "Your father said your mother was a painter," Eleanor said one afternoon, standing in the middle of the studio. "She was," Cassandra replied, her voice flat. "And your grandfather was a chemist." "He was." "They seem like very different worlds." "They are," Cassandra said. "One is about truth, rules, predictable outcomes. The other is about feelings." The last word was uttered with a distinct note of contempt. "You think art isn't about truth?" Eleanor asked, walking over to a large, unfinished painting of a storm-tossed sea. "Goya painted his nightmares to tell the truth about the horrors of war. Van Gogh painted his own madness to show the truth of what was inside him. Your mother, She trailed off, looking at the violent, beautiful brush strokes. What truth was she trying to paint? "I don't know," Cassandra whispered, so quietly Eleanor almost didn't hear it. She never finished it. That was the crack, the first sign of a vulnerability she couldn't hide behind a chemical formula. Eleanor knew she was close to something important. Beatrice Sterling did not take her exile gracefully. She couldn't confront Eleanor directly, but her influence was a subtle poison seeping into the household. Staff members would suddenly become cold and unhelpful. Plans Eleanor made for outings with Cassandra would be mysteriously cancelled due to scheduling conflicts that Julian knew nothing about. The confrontation came during a tense family dinner Beatrice had insisted upon for Julian's birthday. She arrived bearing a gift, a small, exquisitely framed pencil sketch. "I found this in storage, Julian," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "It's one of Papa's original drawings for his molecular models. I thought Cassandra should have it, a reminder of her brilliant legacy." She handed the frame to Cassandra. Julian smiled, genuinely touched. "B, that's incredibly thoughtful." Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. It was too perfect, too calculated. As Cassandra took the frame, Eleanor's eyes, trained to notice the smallest details, caught it. A faint, almost invisible discoloration on the corner of the archival mat board. A pale brownish bloom, the telltale sign of acid burn. "It's beautiful, Aunt Beatrice," Cassandra said, her voice polite but distant. "A true scientist's hand," Beatrice purred, shooting a triumphant look at Eleanor, all precision and logic. No messy, emotional smudges. Later that evening, after Beatrice had left, Eleanor found Cassandra in the library, staring at the sketch. "Something's wrong with it," Cassandra said, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It just feels wrong." "Let me see it," Eleanor said gently. She took the frame and carried it to a desk lamp, tilting it under the light. She pulled a small magnifying loupe from her bag, an old habit from her conservation classes. "Your aunt is right about your grandfather's precision," Eleanor murmured, examining the paper. "But she's wrong about the frame." "What's wrong with the frame?" "It's not archival quality. The matte board is acidic. In 10 years, it would have started to eat away at the paper, turning it yellow. In 20, the pencil lines would have begun to fade." She looked up at Cassandra. "It's a beautiful gift, but it's housed in a slow-acting poison." Cassandra's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding in their depths. It wasn't a careless mistake. It was a message, a perfectly crafted metaphor. "I can dress up my intentions beautifully, but given enough time, I will destroy the things you care about." "She's trying to erase him," Cassandra whispered, looking at the sketch of a complex molecule. "Just like she's trying to erase Mom." "No," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "She's trying to make you think you're the only one who remembers, that you're alone in trying to preserve their legacy." She carefully removed the sketch from its toxic housing. "But you're not. And we're going to get a new frame, one that will protect him." In that moment, the dynamic shifted. Eleanor was no longer just a translator or a companion. She was an ally. Cassandra, for her part, started to see that Eleanor's world of art and preservation wasn't about feelings. It was about science. It was about fighting decay. It was about understanding the fundamental properties of the world in order to save what was precious. She finally walked into her mother's studio. She didn't look at the paintings. Instead, she walked to the chemistry station and ran her hand over the cool steel countertop. "My father had this installed after she died," Cassandra said. "He thought He thought I should be like my grandfather. He thought it would be easier, cleaner. Easier than what? Eleanor asked. Cassandra turned and faced the huge, unfinished painting of the sea. Than being like her. Tears welled in her eyes, the first genuine emotion Eleanor had ever seen from her. The day she died, we had a fight. She wanted me to come to the studio to paint with her. I told her it was stupid and messy. I told her chemistry was real and art was just making things up. The story came tumbling out, a torrent of guilt held back for 3 years. Amelia had been heartbroken. She had gone for a drive to clear her head. A storm had rolled in, a sudden, violent squall. The police report said she lost control of her car on a slick road. She was upset, Cassandra choked out. If I hadn't said those things, she wouldn't have gone for a drive. She would have stayed here. It's my fault. Oh, Cassie, Eleanor said, her heart aching for the little girl who had been carrying this impossible burden. My father, he can't even look at her paintings. He locked this room. He never talks about her. And Aunt Beatrice, she told me I had to be strong for him, that I had to focus on the future, on science, that dwelling on the past was weak. This was the core of it. The poison Beatrice had been administering for years. She hadn't just framed a sketch in acid, she had framed a child's grief in guilt. Your father doesn't look at these paintings because it hurts too much, Eleanor said, her voice fierce with conviction. And your aunt is a manipulative liar. Your mother's death was a tragic accident. It was not your fault. And you are not weak for missing her. You are human. She took a deep breath. And we are going to tell your father the truth. No, I can't. He'll hate me. No, he won't, Eleanor said, pulling out her phone. He's a man who deals in data. It's time we gave him the most important data point of all. She dialed Julian's number. You need to come to the studio, now. It's an emergency. Julian Sterling arrived, pale and frantic, to find his daughter weeping in front of her mother's last painting. He saw Eleanor and his face hardened. What did you do? I listened, Eleanor said simply. Now it's your turn. Hesitantly, prodded by Eleanor, Cassandra told him everything. About the fight, about her guilt, about the things Beatrice had said. Julian's face crumpled. The tech titan, the master of the universe, seemed to shrink before their eyes. He knelt in front of his daughter, his own eyes swimming with tears. Oh, Cassie, he whispered, pulling her into a hug. I never blamed you. Not for a second. I locked this room because I couldn't bear it. I thought if I didn't see her, it wouldn't hurt. I was a coward. He held her tight, his body shaking with sobs. She was so proud of you, of your mind. She loved that you were a scientist. She wanted you to see that you could be a painter, too. That you didn't have to choose. Father and daughter cried together, washing away 3 years of unspoken grief in the room that held its source. Eleanor slipped out, leaving them to find their way back to each other. The equation was finally balancing, but Beatrice Sterling was not a woman who accepted defeat. She had lost her emotional hold on the family. Now, she would come at them with a sledgehammer. The attack came a week later. It was brutal in its simplicity and elegance. Julian had a small collection of old master paintings, kept in a climate-controlled vault adjacent to his study. His most prized possession was a small, luminous Vermeer. The Concert Girl, a rediscovered piece he had acquired at a private auction for a staggering sum. Eleanor arrived one morning to find the penthouse in a state of quiet panic. Julian and Beatrice were in the study with 2 grim-faced art experts. What's going on? Eleanor asked. Beatrice turned, her face a perfect mask of distress. It's a tragedy, Miss Hayes. a complete and utter tragedy. "The Vermeer," Julian said, his voice hollow. "It's a forgery." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What? That's impossible. Your security." "The painting hasn't been stolen," one of the experts explained, a man with a clipped British accent. "It has been replaced. The piece hanging in the vault is a fake, an exceptionally good one, but a fake nonetheless. We've been running an audit of the collection for insurance purposes," Beatrice explained smoothly. "We brought in Mr. Davies and his team. They made the discovery this morning." Julian looked at Eleanor, his face a battle of confusion and nascent suspicion. "You're the only new person who has had access to the collection. I gave you the codes to the vault so you could show Cassie the paintings." The trap sprang. It was so much more insidious than a pawn ticket in a coat pocket. It was a direct assault on Eleanor's credibility, using her own expertise as the weapon. "Julian, I know this is difficult," Beatrice said, placing a comforting hand on her brother's arm, "but we must face the facts. Miss Hayes has a background in art conservation. She would know the technical details required to commission a convincing forgery. And," she hesitated, as if pained to continue, "I took the liberty of having my security team run a background check. She has a grandfather in a private care facility. The bills are astronomical. She's deeply in debt. She has the knowledge, and she has the motive." "That's absurd," Eleanor choked out. "I would never." "Where were you last Tuesday evening, Miss Hayes?" Beatrice asked, her voice sharp. I was in the university library, in the conservation lab." "Alone?" "Yes, I was working on a project." "How convenient," Beatrice said softly. She turned to Julian. "The experts believe the switch happened sometime in the last month, since she started working here. I'm so sorry, Julian. You wanted to believe in her. You let your sentiment cloud your judgment." Julian looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a terrible, wounded doubt. His logical, data-driven mind was being presented with a clear pattern. Access, knowledge, motive. It all pointed to her. The trust they had built was fracturing before her eyes. "Check the security logs for the vault," Eleanor pleaded. "We did," Julian said, his voice heavy. "The log shows you accessed it last Tuesday, at 10 p.m. You were inside for 7 minutes. "Yes, to show Cassie the Rembrandt. We were talking about chiaroscuro," Eleanor cried, turning to where she thought Cassandra would be. But the girl was nowhere to be seen. "Cassandra is in her room," Beatrice said. "She's terribly distraught. She can't believe you would betray us like this." This was it. The final, perfect move. The silence that followed Beatrice's pronouncement was not empty. It was a dense, heavy substance that filled the study, pressing in on Eleanor's ears, stealing the air from her lungs. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut, of a verdict being rendered. Julian's face, a mask of tortured conflict, was the judge's. Beatrice, radiating a chilling, sorrowful triumph, was the executioner. "I think," Beatrice said, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet, "we need to call the police." "No." The word was a gasp, a raw reflex from Eleanor's throat. Her mind, usually a calm, ordered place of chemical compositions and historical timelines, was a maelstrom of pure panic. The loan for her grandfather's care, the looming tuition payment, the sheer, crushing weight of her precarious life. It all coalesced into a single terrifying image. Handcuffs. Beatrice hadn't just framed her. She had built the frame from the very materials of Eleanor's life, her knowledge, her poverty, her ambition. She forced her eyes away from Julian's agonizing doubt and onto the painting propped on the easel, the forgery, the concert girl. It was perfect. The craquelure, the subtle fading of the lapis lazuli in the girl's dress, the soft diffusion of light from the unseen window. It was a ghost of Vermeer, flawless and damning. But art conservation, she reminded herself, clawing for a handhold of professional calm, was never about the flawless whole. It was about the inevitable, microscopic betrayals of time and material. It was about the secrets that surfaces kept. "Wait," she managed, her voice gaining a sliver of its former authority. It trembled, but it did not break. "Before you do anything, let me examine it, properly." Mr. Davies, the portly British expert, gave a condescending chuckle. "My dear girl, with all due respect, we are the world's foremost authorities on the Dutch Golden Age. We have conducted radiographic analysis, pigment spectrometry, dendrochronology on the panel. The lead tin yellow is period correct. The ground is a perfect match for Vermeer's known technique. It is a masterpiece of deception, but a deception nonetheless. There is nothing more to see." His condescension was a spark in the darkness of her fear. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he had thought of everything. "Have you looked at it under ultraviolet light?" The question hung in the air. Davies's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. "Well, no. It wasn't necessary. The pigment analysis was conclusive. There is one material a forger cannot perfectly replicate," Eleanor said, her gaze locking with Julian's, pleading with him for this one last chance. "They can replicate pigments, canvases, even the patterns of age, but they cannot replicate 400 years of slow, molecular decay. They cannot fake the ghost of time itself." She took a breath, her voice growing stronger, fueled by a desperate, burgeoning hope. "In your wife's studio. She must have had a UV lamp, for examining underdrawings, for identifying retouching on canvases." Julian, looking like a man lost in his own home, gave a numb, jerky nod. He murmured something into the intercom on his desk. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was charged with anticipation. Beatrice stood rigid, a marble statue of concern, but Eleanor could see the faint tension in her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes. A household staff member brought in the lamp, a large, professional-grade piece of equipment on a rolling stand. The curtains were drawn, plunging the billion-dollar view and the sunlit study into an artificial twilight. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she positioned the lamp. She felt like an archaeologist about to open a tomb, not knowing if she would find treasure or dust. She flicked the switch. The room was bathed in an eerie, violet glow. The faces of the people around her became strange, alien masks. The forgery on the easel, which had been so luminous in the light, died. It became a flat, dark rectangle, a void that absorbed the purple light. "Vermeer, like most of his contemporaries," Eleanor began, her voice echoing slightly in the hushed room, each word a carefully placed brick in the foundation of her defense, would have used a final varnish made from a natural resin, like mastic or dammer, mixed with linseed oil. Over centuries, as this organic varnish oxidizes and degrades, it develops a natural fluorescence. Under long-wave ultraviolet light, it glows. The color varies, but it's typically a hazy, ghostly, greenish yellow. She gestured toward the dead canvas. Modern synthetic varnishes, the kind a forger would use to achieve a similar gloss and protective layer, do not fluoresce. They are designed to be stable. They absorb UV light. That is why the painting appears almost entirely black. It is a new surface, trying to pretend it is old. "A clever theory," Beatrice cut in, her voice sharp. "But it proves nothing. Perhaps the original was cleaned improperly and revarnished." A competent restorer would never strip a vermeer to the paint layer, Eleanor countered, her eyes scanning the canvas. And if they did, they wouldn't use a modern acrylic varnish. They would use a reversible conservation-grade resin that still has its own distinct, albeit different, fluorescence. She moved closer, her own hands seeming to glow a pale blue in the strange light. Her gaze swept the edges of the painting, the place where secrets hide. And then she saw it. There. Her voice was a whisper. She pointed a trembling finger to the very bottom right edge of the canvas, a small section that would normally be completely obscured by the rabbit of the frame. A tiny, 1-inch square of light. It was not black. It was glowing with a faint but unmistakable, milky, greenish-yellow luminescence. The ghost of time. "What is that?" Julian breathed, taking a step forward. "That," Eleanor said, relief washing over her in a wave so powerful it made her dizzy, "is a cleaning test. When a conservator restores a painting, they often leave a small original patch of the discolored varnish in an inconspicuous area. It's a record. It shows the client how much the painting has brightened, what the original aged surface looked like before treatment. A forger, no matter how skilled, would have no reason to replicate that detail. They are creating a fiction from whole cloth. They wouldn't think to add a footnote from a non-existent history." She straightened up, turning off the lamp and allowing the room to return to its normal state. The forgery on the easel seemed dull and lifeless now, its illusion shattered. She looked directly at Davies, whose face was the color of old parchment. "But you already knew that, didn't you, Mr. Davies? You knew about the fluorescence of aged varnish. Anyone with your purported credentials would. Which means you didn't fail to perform a UV examination because you thought it was unnecessary. You failed to perform it because you knew exactly what it would reveal." The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place, cold and hard and obvious. "You're not an expert. You're a co-conspirator. Beatrice didn't hire you to find a forgery. She hired you to help create one and then validate it." "This is an outrageous, slanderous accusation," Beatrice hissed, taking a step toward Eleanor, her mask of civility finally cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "Is it?" The new voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a diamond scribe on glass. Cassandra stood in the doorway, her grey eyes holding none of their usual contempt or boredom. They were clear, cold, and analytical. In her hands, she held a tablet. "I found the initial premise of your experiment to be flawed, Aunt Beatrice," Cassandra said, her voice precise. "You have always maintained that art is an illogical and frivolous waste of capital. Your sudden, intense interest in auditing Dad's collection was an anomaly, an inconsistent data point. So I did what Dad taught me to do. I investigated the variables." She walked into the room, her gaze fixed on her aunt. "You used a series of shell corporations to move the money, which was smart. But you made a mistake. The final holding company, the one that paid Mr. Davies's firm, has a registered agent in Delaware. That agent is also the registered agent for 3 of your other private equity firms. It was a weak encryption." She turned the tablet screen toward her father. On it was a detailed flowchart of accounts, culminating in a wire transfer confirmation from a company named B.S. Sterling Holdings to Davies Fine Art Authentication. The amount was $200,000. The date of the transfer was 2 months ago, 6 weeks before Eleanor had ever set foot in their home. "You weren't hired this morning, Mr. Davies," Cassandra stated, her voice devoid of emotion. "You were retained 8 weeks ago. The payment was not for an audit. The memo line on the transfer reads, 'Consultation and procurement.' You weren't here to find a forgery. You were here to deliver it." The silence that followed was absolute. Beatrice stared at her niece, her face contorting into a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. The intricate, logical trap she had so carefully constructed had been dismantled not by emotion, not by an appeal to faith, but by a colder, harder, more ruthless logic than her own. She had been outmaneuvered, beaten at her own game by the child she had tried to mold and manipulate. Julian Sterling slowly raised his head. The conflict and pain in his eyes had been replaced by something Eleanor had never seen before, a glacial fury, so profound it seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. He did not shout. His voice, when he finally spoke, was terrifyingly quiet. "Get out of my house, Beatrice." She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to salvage some piece of her shattered plot, but his gaze stopped her. "My security will escort you from the building. Your access to all Sterling accounts and properties is revoked as of this moment. Do not contact me. Do not contact my daughter. The police will not be coming for Miss Hayes." He paused, letting the weight of his next word settle. "They will be coming for you." For the first time, Beatrice looked afraid. The mask was gone, and beneath it was a woman hollowed out by her own venom. She shot one last, poisonous glare at Eleanor, before turning and sweeping from the room, a queen deposed, leaving a vacuum of shock and devastation in her wake. Julian stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. Then he sank into his chair, the formidable titan of tech collapsing into himself. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. He looked up at Eleanor, and the shame etched on his features was so raw it was painful to witness. "Ellie, He couldn't finish. His voice broke. "The data. It all pointed to you. Access. Motive. It was logical. And for a moment, I believed it." His eyes were glistening. "I am so sorry. I failed you." "It was a logical conclusion," Eleanor said softly, the adrenaline finally draining from her system, leaving her limbs feeling heavy and cold. "That's what she was counting on. She knows how your mind works. She weaponized your own logic against you." She looked over at Cassandra, who had come to stand beside her, a silent, steadfast presence. "But your daughter," Eleanor added, meeting the girl's clear grey eyes. "She has her mother's soul. She looks for the truth behind the data." The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a quiet, somber excavation. The real Vermeer was recovered from a climate-controlled storage unit in New Jersey, surrendered by Davies in a desperate bid for leniency. Beatrice vanished into a maelstrom of lawyers and litigation, a ghost who haunted only the business section of the papers. The true reconstruction happened within the sterile walls of the penthouse. A few nights after the confrontation, Julian found Eleanor in the library, where she was carefully rehousing the pencil sketch of his father-in-law's in a new, acid-free archival frame. "I've been thinking about your grandfather," he said, his voice subdued. He looked tired, older than he had a week ago. "About the cost of his care, about the debt you're in. It was Beatrice's primary leverage against you." "It was my primary reality," Eleanor corrected gently. "I know." He walked over to the vast window, staring down at the river of lights that was Central Park South. "When Amelia died, I sealed off her studio. I thought I was preserving her memory. But I wasn't. I was burying it. I was so terrified of the pain, of the messiness of it all, that I tried to turn my life and Cassie's life into a clean equation. Something I could control. I pushed my daughter toward the sterile world of chemistry because I was afraid of the beautiful, chaotic world of her mother." He turned to face her. "Beatrice thrived in that vacuum. She fed my fear of emotion, my reliance on cold logic. She told me Cassie needed structure, discipline. What she really meant was that Cassie needed to be contained, scrubbed clean of her mother's influence, and I let her do it, because I was a coward. This was the confession that mattered more than any apology. It was the data point he had been missing all along. "You're not a coward, Julian," Eleanor said. "You were grieving. You were trying to protect your daughter and yourself in the only way you knew how." "And you," he said, a flicker of his old authority returning, but tempered now with humility. "You showed us a different way, not by ignoring the science, but by using it to understand the art. You showed me they were never separate worlds to begin with." He took a deep breath. "The grant I offered you is insufficient. It's a rich man's bandage on a problem he helped create. I'm dissolving it." Eleanor's heart sank. For a foolish moment, she thought he was rescinding the offer. "Instead," he continued, "I am endowing a new research center at Columbia. It will be called the Amelia Sterling Institute for Art and Material Science. Its mission will be to bridge the gap between the two disciplines, to use scientific analysis to preserve and understand our shared cultural heritage. It will be funded in perpetuity, and I want you to be its first director when you graduate." He also, he added, had taken the liberty of transferring her grandfather to a specialized neurological institute in Boston, assuming all costs for his care, indefinitely. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't an escape hatch from her life anymore. It was a new life handed to her. But she looked at this man, stripped of his arrogance, and saw not a benefactor, but a partner in an act of restoration. The real change, however, was not in the endowments or the bank accounts. It was in the air of the penthouse itself. The profound, sterile silence was gone. It was replaced by something else. Weeks later, Eleanor let herself in, intending to drop off some books for Cassandra. She was met not by a silent butler, but by a sound she had never once heard in this apartment. Music. It was a chaotic, beautiful jazz piece, spilling from the direction of the art studio. Following it, she found the door, once perpetually closed, wide open. The room was no longer a mausoleum. It was a vibrant, chaotic laboratory of creation. Canvases of all sizes were stacked against the walls. Jars of pigments were lined up on a table next to gleaming chemistry beakers. And in the center of the room, side by side at two large easels, stood Julian and Cassandra. Julian, wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and a comical smear of phthalo blue across his forehead, was staring at his canvas with the same frustrated intensity he usually reserved for market analysis. He was trying to paint a sunset, but the result was a muddy, bruised-looking mess. Cassandra, a streak of cadmium yellow on her cheek, was working with a quiet, focused intensity. Her canvas was a stunning, almost abstract representation of molecular structures, but painted with the wild, emotional brushstrokes of her mother. She was not her grandfather or her mother. She was both. A perfect, stable synthesis. She saw Eleanor and her face broke into a wide, genuine grin that transformed her. "Ellie, your timing is impeccable. Dad is experiencing a catastrophic failure in color theory. He mixed complementary colors and created a neutral gray, and now he's claiming the laws of physics have betrayed him." Julian looked up, his expression one of utter, helpless defeat. But his eyes were alive and happier than she had ever seen them. "It's alchemy," he said with a laugh. "This is harder than quantum mechanics. She keeps telling me it's about feeling, but there must be an algorithm for it." Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, the sound of the music, the smell of turpentine and oil paint, the sight of this father and daughter making a beautiful, unpredictable mess together washing over her. She hadn't just been a translator or a tutor. She had been a conservator. She had been called in to assess a priceless work that was tearing itself apart from the inside. She had analyzed the environment, identified the acidic elements, and neutralized the decay. She had patiently, painstakingly, cleaned away the layers of grime, the guilt and grief and fear that had obscured the brilliant composition underneath. In a world Julian Sterling had tried to control with data and logic, she had shown him that the most complex systems were not found in the stock market or in lines of code, but in the human heart. And she had proven that the most valuable work was not in creating something new, but in the quiet, delicate, scientific art of saving what was in danger of being lost forever.